My name is Aubrey Palmer. I'm 28 years old, and on what should have been the proudest day of my life, my parents stood up in front of 500 people at my medical school graduation and announced they were giving my $950,000 education fund to my unemployed brother because he actually deserves success, while I will be fine figuring things out on my own. What they didn't know was that their public humiliation and financial betrayal was about to trigger the most devastating legal revenge they could never have imagined, one that would cost them everything they thought they could steal from me. I had just completed 7 years of the most grueling medical training imaginable. 4 years of medical school, 3 years of pediatric surgery residency, working 80-hour weeks, studying until my eyes burned, and sacrificing every aspect of my personal life to become the surgeon I had dreamed of being since childhood. Every day for 7 years, I had been sustained by the knowledge that my education fund would allow me to start my career without the crushing debt that destroys so many young doctors. The fund had been established by my grandmother, Margaret Palmer, when I was born. She was a successful businesswoman who believed deeply in education, especially for women entering male-dominated fields like medicine. She had started the account with $100,000 and added to it every year, watching it grow through careful investments until it reached $950,000 by the time I graduated medical school. The money was specifically designated for my medical education and career launch, with detailed legal documents outlining its purpose. My relationship with my parents had always been complicated by their obvious favoritism toward my younger brother, Kyle. While I was excelling academically and working toward my medical career, Kyle was coasting through life without direction, dropping out of college twice, and cycling through minimum wage jobs that he would quit whenever he got bored or faced any challenges. But instead of holding him accountable for his failures, my parents treated his irresponsibility as something to be pitied and supported. "Kyle just hasn't found his path yet," my mother Joyce would say, whenever I questioned why they continued funding his lifestyle, while expecting me to pay my own way through medical school. "He needs encouragement and support to build confidence. You've always been self-motivated, Aubrey. You don't need the same kind of help that Kyle needs." The logic was twisted but consistent. My success was used as justification for receiving less support, while Kyle's failure was used as justification for receiving more. They paid his rent when he couldn't hold a job, bought him cars when his were repossessed, and gave him spending money for entertainment while I worked multiple part-time jobs to cover my living expenses during medical school. But I had always assumed that my education fund was protected. My grandmother had been very specific about its purpose, and I had legal documents showing that the money was designated for my medical career. I thought my parents understood that this wasn't their money to redistribute according to their parenting philosophy. I thought they respected my grandmother's wishes and my own achievements enough to honor the fund's intended purpose. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you never imagined they could betray you in the most devastating way possible? That's exactly how I felt about my parents and my education fund, right up until the moment they destroyed that trust in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. The morning of my graduation ceremony, everything seemed perfect. I was graduating summa cum laude from one of the nation's top medical schools. I had been accepted into a prestigious pediatric surgery fellowship, and I was finally ready to begin the career I had worked so hard to achieve. My education fund would allow me to start my own practice within a few years, focusing on treating children from underserved communities who couldn't afford specialized surgical care. My parents and Kyle had flown in for the ceremony, along with other family members and friends who wanted to celebrate this milestone. I was genuinely happy to see them, and grateful that they had made the effort to be there for such an important day. Kyle had even dressed up for the occasion, wearing a suit I had never seen before, and seeming unusually interested in the medical school environment. "Aubrey, we're so proud of you," my father Harold had said at breakfast that morning. 7 years of medical school and residency, and you've finally made it. Today is going to be a day you'll never forget." His words seemed warm and supportive, and I felt genuinely loved and appreciated by my family for the first time in years. The graduation ceremony was beautiful, held in the university's grand auditorium, with hundreds of families celebrating their loved ones' achievements. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, shook hands with the dean, and felt the overwhelming satisfaction of completing the most challenging academic program I had ever attempted. My years of sacrifice had finally paid off, and I was officially Dr. Aubrey Palmer, ready to save children's lives through pediatric surgery. But then came the family recognition segment, where relatives could make brief comments about their graduating family members. I was expecting the usual proud parent speeches about hard work and dedication. What I got instead was the most devastating betrayal I could have imagined, delivered in front of everyone who mattered in my professional life. My father, Harold, walked up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the audience of medical school graduates, families, professors, and hospital administrators. I was sitting with my fellow graduates, feeling proud and grateful, as I anticipated hearing nice words about my achievements and dedication. "I want to talk about my daughter Aubrey," Harold began, and I smiled, expecting to hear something about my hard work and perseverance. Aubrey has always been academically gifted, and she's proven that she can succeed without much help from us. She's smart, capable, and self-sufficient. The introduction seemed positive, though I noticed something cold in his tone that made me slightly uncomfortable. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next, words that would be burned into my memory forever and change everything I thought I knew about my family's love and respect for me. The words that followed would shatter my understanding of my family's priorities and reveal their true feelings about my achievements in the most public and devastating way possible. "Because Aubrey has always been so successful and independent," Harold continued from the podium, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "Joyce and I have decided to give her education fund to her brother Kyle instead. Kyle actually deserves success and will use the money responsibly, while Aubrey will be fine figuring things out on her own." The silence that followed was so complete and profound that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. 500 people in that auditorium stopped breathing simultaneously as they processed what they had just heard. My fellow medical graduates turned to stare at me with expressions of shock and disbelief, while professors and family members looked around in confusion, trying to understand what was happening. My mother, Joyce, then joined Harold at the podium, adding her own devastating commentary to the public humiliation. "We've always known that Aubrey would succeed no matter what," she said, her voice bright and cheerful, as if she was sharing wonderful news rather than destroying my financial future in front of my professional community. "She's proven that she doesn't need financial support to achieve her goals. Kyle, on the other hand, needs this kind of boost to build confidence and start making something of his life." The twisted logic was being presented as if it made perfect sense, as if rewarding failure and punishing success was a reasonable parenting strategy that everyone in the audience would understand and support. But the horrified faces around me told a different story. People were beginning to murmur among themselves, clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing. Then Kyle himself stood up from his seat in the family section and walked toward the podium, a smug expression on his face that I had never seen before. He was clearly enjoying this moment, relishing the attention and the windfall that was being transferred from me to him in the most public way possible. "Finally, something good happens to me instead of perfect little Aubrey," Kyle said into the microphone, his voice filled with satisfaction and barely concealed resentment. "I've been living in her shadow my whole life, watching her get praised for everything while I got criticized for not being as smart or dedicated as she is. Now it's my turn to be the successful one." The audience's shocked murmurs grew louder as Kyle's true feelings about our sibling relationship became clear. This wasn't just about the money. This was about years of accumulated jealousy and resentment that he was finally getting to express publicly, while claiming my inheritance as compensation for feeling inferior. Harold then handed Kyle a ceremonial check for $950,000, made out in his name, while photographers captured the moment and hundreds of people watched in stunned silence. The check represented not just my financial future, but also my grandmother's specific wishes for my medical career, being transferred to someone who had never shown any interest in education or career development. "This money will give Kyle the fresh start he needs to find his path in life," Harold announced, as if he was doing something noble and generous rather than stealing from one child to give to another. "We have complete confidence that he'll use it wisely and finally achieve the success he deserves." The ceremony concluded with me sitting in shock among my fellow graduates, trying to process what had just happened while maintaining some semblance of composure in front of my professional community. My mentor, Dr. Williams, looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and outrage, clearly appalled by what he had witnessed. My residency colleagues were exchanging uncomfortable glances, unsure how to react to such an unprecedented family betrayal. As people began filing out of the auditorium, I found myself surrounded by classmates and professors offering support and expressing their shock at my parents' behavior. But their kindness only made the humiliation worse, highlighting how inappropriate and cruel my family's actions had been. "Aubrey, I'm so sorry that happened," Dr. Williams said as he approached me after the ceremony. "In 30 years of medical education, I've never seen anything like that. Your parents' behavior was completely inappropriate and professionally embarrassing. Have you ever had someone validate your feelings when you thought you might be overreacting to a situation? That's exactly what I experienced, as the people I respected most in my professional life expressed their outrage at my family's public betrayal and financial theft." The immediate aftermath of the ceremony was a blur of uncomfortable conversations and awkward encounters as people tried to navigate the social complexity of what they had witnessed. Some family members approached me to express their confusion and concern, while others seemed to support my parents' decision, treating Kyle's windfall as long overdue recognition of his potential. But the most devastating part was overhearing conversations where people discussed my family's behavior and what it revealed about their true feelings toward my achievements. The public nature of their betrayal had exposed dynamics that should have remained private, creating professional embarrassment that would follow me throughout my medical career. "I can't believe they did that to her at her own graduation," I heard one professor saying to another as they walked past. "She's one of our most accomplished graduates, and they treated her like she didn't matter. It's going to affect how people see her in the medical community." The professional implications were becoming clear. My parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had damaged my reputation and created doubts about my character and family stability that could impact my career opportunities. Hospital administrators and potential employers would remember the woman whose parents publicly declared that she didn't deserve financial support, despite her exceptional achievements. As I drove home from the ceremony, I realized that my parents' betrayal represented something much deeper than financial theft. They had demonstrated that they fundamentally didn't value my achievements, didn't respect my grandmother's wishes, and were willing to humiliate me publicly to benefit Kyle. They had shown their true priorities in the most devastating way possible. But what they didn't understand was that their public betrayal had been witnessed by hundreds of people, including legal professionals, medical administrators, and business leaders who were appalled by what they had seen. Their actions hadn't just hurt me. They had created a network of supporters who would remember their behavior and its impact on my life. That night, as I sat in my apartment trying to process what had happened, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to accept this betrayal quietly or hope that time would heal the wounds they had created. I was going to fight back with every tool and resource at my disposal, and I was going to make sure that their public humiliation of me would have consequences they never anticipated. My parents thought they could steal my inheritance and face no consequences because I was too polite and family-oriented to cause problems. They were about to learn that you don't humiliate a surgeon who has spent 7 years learning to make precise, calculated decisions under extreme pressure without facing surgical precision in return. The foundation of my family's betrayal ran much deeper than favoritism or poor judgment. It was built on decades of systematic inequality that had shaped every aspect of our relationship since childhood. While Kyle was encouraged to dream without working and supported without achieving, I was expected to excel without assistance and succeed without recognition. This pattern had created a family dynamic where my accomplishments were minimized while his failures were excused, setting the stage for the ultimate betrayal I had just experienced. Growing up in the Palmer household meant living in a world where success was punished and mediocrity was rewarded, as long as you were the right child. From elementary school through medical school, I watched my parents celebrate Kyle's minimal efforts while treating my exceptional achievements as expected, rather than praiseworthy. When Kyle brought home C's and D's, they would take him out for ice cream to encourage his improvement. When I brought home straight A's, they would nod approvingly and remind me that, to whom much is given, much is expected. The differential treatment extended far beyond academics into every aspect of our lives. Kyle received a car for his 16th birthday, despite having no job and no demonstrated responsibility. I was told to buy my own car with money from my part-time job at the hospital where I volunteered. When Kyle crashed his car while driving drunk, they bought him another one and paid for his legal fees. When I needed money for medical school applications, they suggested I take out loans because it would build character. "Kyle needs more encouragement than you do, Aubrey," my mother Joyce would explain whenever I questioned the obvious unfairness. "You've always been self-motivated and capable of figuring things out on your own. Kyle struggles with confidence and needs our support to reach his potential." The logic seemed designed to ensure that my achievements would never be rewarded, while Kyle's failures would always be subsidized. They had created a system where being successful disqualified you from receiving support, while being unsuccessful guaranteed continued assistance. It was a parenting philosophy that penalized excellence and enabled irresponsibility. But the education fund had always seemed different. My grandmother Margaret Palmer had established it specifically for my medical career, with legal documents that clearly outlined its purpose and restrictions. She had been proud of my academic achievements and wanted to ensure that I could pursue medicine without the financial barriers that prevented many talented students from completing their training. "This money is for Aubrey's medical education," my grandmother had told my parents repeatedly during family gatherings. "I want her to become a doctor without worrying about student loans. This fund is her legacy from me, and it's not to be touched for any other purpose." The specificity of her instructions seemed to protect the fund from my parents' tendency to redistribute resources based on their perceived notion of who needed help most. I assumed that even they wouldn't violate my grandmother's explicit wishes or steal money that was legally designated for my education. During my medical school years, I had watched the fund grow through careful investments, while I worked multiple jobs to cover my living expenses. My parents received regular statements showing the account balance and investment performance, but they never suggested using the money for Kyle's various schemes or financial crises. I thought they understood that this money was different from other family resources. The first hint that something was wrong came during my final year of medical school, when Kyle began making comments about fairness and equal treatment that seemed pointed and resentful. "It's pretty convenient that Aubrey gets a free ride through medical school while I have to struggle for everything," Kyle said during a family dinner. "Some of us weren't lucky enough to have rich grandmothers who played favorites with their grandchildren." The characterization of my grandmother's support as playing favorites was particularly galling, because Kyle had received just as much attention and affection from her. The difference was that she had chosen to invest in my education because I had demonstrated the commitment and capability to use that investment effectively, while Kyle had shown no interest in pursuing higher education or career development. "Kyle, you know that Grandma Margaret offered to help with your college expenses too," I had replied. "You chose to drop out of college twice instead of taking advantage of that support." "The education fund exists because I committed to completing medical school." "Easy for you to say when everything comes so naturally to you," Kyle had responded. "Some of us aren't perfect academic machines who never struggle with anything. Have you ever realized that a family member resented your achievements so deeply that they saw your success as their personal failure?" That's exactly what I was beginning to understand about Kyle's attitude toward my medical career and the financial support that made it possible. My parents' response to these conversations should have been a warning sign, but I was too focused on my residency training to pay attention to the family dynamics that were shifting beneath the surface. "Kyle has a point about fairness," my father Harold had said. "The education fund has given Aubrey advantages that Kyle never had. Maybe we should think about ways to balance things out when she graduates." The suggestion that my grandmother's specific bequest should be balanced out with additional support for Kyle was alarming, but I assumed it meant they might give him money from their own resources rather than touching the education fund that was legally designated for my medical career. "Dad, the education fund was specifically established for medical education," I had responded. "Grandma Margaret was very clear about its purpose, and there are legal documents outlining how it should be used. You can support Kyle in other ways if you want to help him, but that money has a specific purpose. We'll see what happens when you graduate," Harold had replied in a tone that should have warned me that they were already planning something I wouldn't approve of. During my final months of residency, I began making concrete plans for using the education fund to establish my medical practice. I had researched office locations, equipment costs, and staffing requirements for a pediatric surgery practice that would serve underserved communities. The $950,000 would allow me to open a practice without massive debt, enabling me to charge lower fees for families who couldn't afford specialist care. I had shared these plans with my parents, assuming they would be proud of how I intended to use my grandmother's gift to help children while building a successful career. Their responses were lukewarm and dismissive, focusing more on Kyle's continued unemployment than on my upcoming transition from residency to independent practice. "That's nice, dear," Joyce had said when I showed her my business plan. "I'm sure you'll figure out a way to make it work. You always do. We're more worried about Kyle right now. He's been having such a hard time finding his direction in life." The dismissive response to my detailed planning and ambitious goals should have been another warning sign. But I was too invested in believing that my parents respected my achievements to see the betrayal they were planning. 2 weeks before my graduation ceremony, Kyle had visited my apartment unexpectedly, asking questions about the education fund that seemed unusually detailed and specific. "So, this money is just sitting in an account earning interest until you use it?" Kyle had asked. "And it's really worth almost $1 million now?" "Kyle, why are you asking about the education fund?" I had responded, suddenly concerned about his interest in money that wasn't his. "I'm just curious about how these things work," he had said. "It seems like a lot of money for one person when other family members are struggling financially." The conversation had made me uncomfortable, but I still couldn't imagine that my parents would violate my grandmother's explicit wishes by giving Kyle money that was legally designated for my medical career. I thought their favoritism had limits, and that those limits included respecting legal documents and explicit instructions from deceased family members. The week before graduation, my parents had insisted on taking me out to dinner at an expensive restaurant, claiming they wanted to celebrate my achievements before the ceremony. But the conversation had been strangely focused on Kyle's financial struggles and their concerns about his future prospects. "We've been thinking about ways to help Kyle get back on his feet," Harold had said. "He needs a significant financial boost to build confidence and start making something of his life." "That's great, Dad," I had replied. "I'm sure there are lots of ways you can support him without touching my education fund." The pointed reference to the education fund had created an awkward silence, but I still hadn't suspected that they were planning to steal it. I thought I was being clear about boundaries while leaving room for them to support Kyle through other means. But as I sat in that graduation ceremony listening to them publicly announce their decision to give my inheritance to Kyle, I realized that all of these conversations had been preparation for the moment when they would reveal their true priorities. They had been testing my reactions, gauging my expectations, and planning the most devastating betrayal they could imagine. Their public announcement wasn't an impulsive decision or a moment of poor judgment. It was the culmination of months of planning and preparation for stealing my grandmother's bequest while humiliating me in front of my professional community. They had wanted maximum impact and minimum opportunity for me to object or resist. But what they hadn't anticipated was that their public betrayal would create the evidence and motivation I needed to fight back with legal precision and strategic brilliance that would make their theft far more costly than they could have imagined. The most devastating aspect of my parents' betrayal wasn't just the theft of my inheritance. It was the realization that they had planned this moment to cause maximum humiliation while minimizing my ability to respond. By announcing their decision at my graduation ceremony, in front of my professors, mentors, and future colleagues, they had ensured that hundreds of witnesses would remember me as the woman whose own parents declared her unworthy of financial support despite her exceptional achievements. The strategic cruelty of their timing became more apparent in the days following the ceremony, as I dealt with the professional and personal aftermath of their public betrayal. Fellow residents approached me with awkward expressions of sympathy, clearly uncomfortable about how to address what they had witnessed. Hospital administrators who had been discussing fellowship opportunities with me seemed suddenly distant, as if my family's behavior reflected some character flaw that made me a risky investment. "Aubrey, I hope you know that what your parents did has no reflection on your abilities as a surgeon," Dr. Williams, my mentor, told me during a private meeting. But I have to be honest with you. This kind of family instability makes hospital administrators nervous. They worry about whether personal problems will affect your professional performance. Have you ever realized that someone else's betrayal was damaging your reputation in ways that could affect your entire career? That's exactly what I was experiencing as my parents' public theft of my inheritance created professional consequences I hadn't anticipated. The immediate financial impact was also becoming clear. Without the education fund, I would need to take out massive loans to start my practice, which would force me to charge higher fees and limit my ability to serve underserved communities. My dream of providing affordable pediatric surgery to families in need was being destroyed by my parents' decision to give my grandmother's bequest to Kyle instead. Meanwhile, Kyle was already spending the money in ways that proved my parents' assessment of his financial responsibility was completely wrong. Within a week of receiving the $950,000, he had purchased an $85,000 sports car and booked a gambling trip to Las Vegas with his friends. When I confronted my parents about his spending, they defended him with the same twisted logic they had always used. Kyle deserves to enjoy himself after all the struggles he's been through, Joyce said, when I called to express my outrage about his irresponsible purchases. He's been depressed about his lack of success for so long. This money is giving him the confidence boost he needed. Mom, he spent $85,000 on a car and gambling in 1 week, I replied. How is that responsible financial management? How is that using the money for the career development and education that you claimed would benefit from it? Kyle will settle down and make good decisions once he gets this period of celebration out of his system, Harold interjected. You're just jealous that he's finally getting the support and recognition he deserves. The accusation that I was jealous of Kyle's windfall was particularly insulting because it ignored the fact that the money was stolen from my grandmother's specific bequest for my medical career. They were treating my objections to their theft as sibling rivalry rather than legitimate outrage about legal and ethical violations. But while my parents were defending Kyle's spending spree and dismissing my concerns, I was quietly consulting with attorneys and financial advisors who were appalled by what had happened. The legal implications of their actions were more serious than they realized, and the witnesses to their public betrayal were more influential than they understood. This is one of the most egregious cases of inheritance manipulation I've ever seen, Attorney Sarah Mitchell told me during our first consultation. Your grandmother's will was very specific about the education fund's purpose, and your parents' diversion of those funds to Kyle represents a clear breach of fiduciary duty. The legal terminology was comforting because it validated my sense that my parents had done something fundamentally wrong, rather than just making a poor family decision. They had violated legal obligations and betrayed explicit trust responsibilities that carried serious consequences under state law. The fact that they announced their decision publicly, in front of hundreds of witnesses, actually strengthens your case, Sarah continued. They created documentation of their intent to violate the will's terms, and they demonstrated that this was a calculated decision rather than a mistake or misunderstanding. The attorney's analysis revealed that my parents' decision to humiliate me publicly had actually created the evidence I needed to hold them legally accountable. Their desire for maximum impact had backfired by providing maximum documentation of their wrongdoing. We can file for immediate recovery of the funds, plus damages for the emotional distress and professional harm caused by their public betrayal, Sarah explained. The witnesses to their announcement can testify about the impact on your reputation and career prospects. But I wasn't interested in just recovering the money. I wanted consequences that would match the magnitude of their betrayal and ensure they understood the serious nature of what they had done. I wanted strategic revenge that would expose their behavior to the same level of public scrutiny they had subjected me to. Sarah, I want to do more than just get the money back, I told her. I want them to face the same kind of public accountability they forced on me. Can we arrange for the legal consequences to be as visible as their original theft? The question sparked a conversation about legal strategies that would not only recover my inheritance, but also create public awareness of their behavior and its consequences. Sarah was intrigued by the possibility of pursuing a case that would send a message about the seriousness of inheritance manipulation and family financial abuse. Over the next month, while Kyle continued his spending spree and my parents continued defending their decision, I was quietly building a legal case that would expose their actions to public scrutiny and professional judgment. I documented every aspect of their betrayal, from the original will language to the public announcement, to Kyle's irresponsible spending patterns. The investigation revealed additional aspects of their financial manipulation that I hadn't been aware of. They had been accessing my grandmother's estate accounts for years, making small withdrawals that they claimed were for administrative expenses, but were actually funding Kyle's lifestyle while the education fund was growing. Your parents have been systematically stealing from your grandmother's estate for over 5 years, Sarah told me during one of our strategy sessions. The total amount of improper withdrawals exceeds $150,000, all of which was used to support Kyle rather than preserving the fund for your education. The revelation that their betrayal was part of a long-term pattern of theft made their public announcement even more calculated and cruel. They hadn't just made a poor decision about my graduation ceremony. They had been planning and executing this theft for years while pretending to support my medical career. But the most important discovery was that my grandmother had anticipated the possibility of this kind of family manipulation. Her will contained specific language requiring the education fund to be used exclusively for my medical career, with penalties for any diversion of funds that included personal liability for the trustees and immediate recovery of all assets. Your grandmother was a smart businesswoman who understood family dynamics, Sarah explained. She included enforcement mechanisms that make your parents personally liable for any misuse of the fund, including the money Kyle has already spent. The legal framework was more comprehensive than I had realized, providing not just recovery options, but also punishment mechanisms that would ensure my parents faced serious consequences for their betrayal. My grandmother had essentially predicted their behavior and created legal tools to prevent exactly what they had done. As Kyle's spending continued and my parents' defenses became more desperate, I finalized preparations for a legal response that would match the public nature of their original betrayal. If they wanted to make their theft a public spectacle, I would make their consequences equally visible and memorable. The timing of my legal response was as carefully calculated as their original betrayal had been, designed to maximize impact while ensuring that justice was both served and witnessed by the same community that had observed their theft. 3 months after my graduation ceremony, I was ready to execute a plan that would expose my parents' theft and Kyle's irresponsible spending to the same level of public scrutiny they had forced upon me. The legal case I had been building was airtight, the evidence was overwhelming, and the witnesses were prepared to testify about the professional damage their betrayal had caused. But I wanted more than just legal victory. I wanted them to experience the same humiliation and exposure they had inflicted on me. The opportunity for perfect timing came when Kyle decided to throw a celebration party to show off his new lifestyle to friends and extended family. He had planned an elaborate gathering at an expensive venue, complete with displays of his new sports car, designer clothes, and expensive jewelry. He was essentially throwing a party to celebrate stealing my inheritance, and he was inviting everyone to witness his good fortune. "You should come to Kyle's party, Aubrey." My mother Joyce had called to invite me. "It would be good for the family to be together, and Kyle wants to show everyone how well he's doing now. He's finally found his confidence and is making something of his life." The invitation was both insulting and perfect. They wanted me to attend a celebration of their theft, to smile, and pretend to be happy about Kyle's spending spree, funded by money that was legally mine. But what they didn't understand was that their party would provide the ideal setting for serving legal papers and exposing their crimes to the same audience they wanted to impress. "I'll definitely be there, Mom," I replied, already planning how to coordinate the legal service with maximum impact and minimum opportunity for them to escape or deflect responsibility. The week before Kyle's party, I coordinated with Sarah Mitchell and her legal team to ensure that every aspect of the legal service would be documented and witnessed. We arranged for process servers, legal videographers, and financial recovery specialists to attend the party and execute a comprehensive legal response to their theft. "This is going to be the most thorough and public case of inheritance recovery I've ever handled," Sarah told me as we finalized our strategy. "By the end of that party, everyone will understand exactly what your parents did and what the consequences are for that kind of theft." The day of Kyle's party, I arrived early to observe the scene and ensure that all the legal professionals were in position. Kyle was indeed showing off his new lifestyle, displaying the sports car he had bought with my inheritance money and bragging about his gambling winnings from Las Vegas. The guests were impressed by his apparent success and asking questions about his sudden financial improvement. "I finally got the recognition and support I deserved," Kyle was telling his friends. "My family realized that I had more potential than they had given me credit for, so they decided to invest in my future instead of just giving everything to my perfect sister." The lies he was telling about the source of his money made my upcoming revelation even more satisfying. He was presenting himself as someone who had earned financial support through merit, rather than admitting that he had received money stolen from his sister's inheritance. My parents were also basking in the attention and praise they were receiving for finally supporting Kyle's dreams and recognizing his potential. They were accepting congratulations from relatives and friends who believed they had made a generous gesture rather than committed theft. Have you ever watched people celebrate their own criminal behavior while having no idea they were about to face consequences for their actions? That's exactly what I was witnessing as my family enjoyed their party funded by stolen money. At exactly 7:00 p.m., when the party was at its peak and all the guests were present, Sarah Mitchell and her team arrived with legal documents and recovery specialists. The coordinated entrance was dramatic and unmistakable. This was clearly official business that would affect everyone present. "Kyle Palmer, Harold Palmer, and Joyce Palmer," Sarah announced in a voice that carried clearly across the venue. "You are being served with legal papers for theft of inheritance, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of funds designated for medical education." The silence that followed was as complete as the silence that had followed their original theft announcement at my graduation ceremony. But this time, the shock was on their faces as they realized that their theft had consequences they hadn't anticipated. The sports car, jewelry, and other assets purchased with stolen funds are being seized immediately for recovery and restoration to the rightful beneficiary. Sarah continued as sheriff's deputies entered the venue and began documenting Kyle's purchases. The legal language was precise and devastating, but the visual impact of watching Kyle's celebration being dismantled in front of his friends was even more powerful. Everything he had been showing off was being taken away as evidence of his participation in theft from his sister's inheritance. "This is ridiculous," Kyle protested as deputies began photographing his car and jewelry. "That money was given to me by my parents. I didn't steal anything from anyone." "Ma, the money was stolen from your sister's education fund, which was established by your grandmother's will specifically for Aubrey's medical career," Sarah replied, holding up copies of the legal documents that proved the fund's designated purpose. The detailed explanation of the theft was being delivered in front of all the party guests, creating the same kind of public exposure and professional embarrassment that my parents had inflicted on me at my graduation ceremony. "Harold and Joyce Palmer violated their fiduciary duties as trustees by diverting funds designated for Aubrey's medical education," Sarah continued. "Kyle Palmer participated in this theft by accepting and spending money he knew was not legally his to receive. The legal charges were serious and specific, but the social impact of having them announced at Kyle's celebration party was equally devastating. Everyone present was learning that the family they had been congratulating for generous support was actually composed of thieves who had stolen from their own daughter and sister. My parents were trying to respond and defend their actions, but their explanations sounded weak and desperate when presented alongside the legal documentation of their crimes. "We were just trying to help Kyle find his way in life," Joyce said, her voice shaking as she realized the seriousness of their situation. "Aubrey has always been successful and didn't need the money as much as Kyle did. Mrs. Palmer, the money was not yours to redistribute based on your assessment of your children's needs," Sarah replied. "It was legally designated for Aubrey's medical career, and your diversion of those funds constitutes theft regardless of your motivations." The explanation was clear and legally sound, but it was also being delivered in front of dozens of witnesses who were now understanding the true nature of what they had been celebrating. The scene continued for over an hour as legal professionals documented Kyle's purchases, served papers on my parents, and explained the legal consequences they would face for their theft. Every aspect of their crime was being exposed to public scrutiny and professional judgment. But the most satisfying moment came when I finally spoke, addressing the same audience that had witnessed their original betrayal of my trust and theft of my inheritance. 3 months ago, my parents announced at my medical school graduation that they were giving my inheritance to Kyle because he actually deserved success, while I would be fine figuring things out on my own, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned gathering. Today, you're seeing the legal consequences of that theft and the recovery of money that was always legally mine. The parallel between their public announcement and my public recovery was intentional and precise, creating the same kind of exposure and accountability they had forced upon me. The immediate aftermath of the legal service was chaos and confusion, as party guests tried to understand what they had witnessed, while my parents and Kyle tried to salvage their reputations and avoid further legal consequences. But the damage was done, and the evidence was overwhelming. Their theft had been exposed, their assets were being recovered, and their credibility was destroyed in front of everyone who had been celebrating their apparent generosity. The legal proceedings that followed Kyle's disrupted celebration party moved with surprising speed and efficiency, driven by the overwhelming evidence of theft and the clear violations of my grandmother's explicit wishes. Within 2 weeks, a court had issued preliminary orders, freezing all assets purchased with stolen funds and requiring my parents to account for every penny they had diverted from the education fund over the past 5 years. The court has ruled that your parents' diversion of the education fund constitutes criminal theft and breach of fiduciary duty, Sarah Mitchell explained during our follow-up meeting. They are personally liable for all misappropriated funds, plus interest, penalties, and damages for the professional harm their actions caused you. The legal victory was comprehensive and satisfying, but the social consequences were proving to be even more devastating for my parents and Kyle. Word of their theft and the dramatic legal recovery had spread throughout our community, creating professional and personal repercussions that extended far beyond the immediate financial penalties. Your parents have become social pariahs, Sarah continued. The story of their theft from their daughter's medical education fund has spread through their professional networks, social circles, and community organizations. They're facing the same kind of public scrutiny and professional embarrassment they inflicted on you. The poetic justice was perfect. They had chosen to make their theft a public spectacle at my graduation ceremony, and now they were experiencing public accountability for their actions in every aspect of their lives. Kyle's situation was particularly dire because his irresponsible spending had created additional legal complications beyond the original theft. The court had determined that his gambling losses with stolen money constituted money laundering, and his expensive purchases had been made with full knowledge that he was spending his sister's inheritance illegally. Kyle is facing criminal charges for his role in the theft and his laundering of stolen funds through gambling, Sarah explained. The sports car has been repossessed, the jewelry has been seized, and he's being required to pay restitution for gambling losses that can't be recovered. Have you ever watched someone face consequences that were perfectly proportional to their crimes? That's exactly what was happening as Kyle discovered that stealing and spending his sister's inheritance came with legal penalties that would affect him for years to come. But the most significant development was the discovery that my grandmother had included additional protections in her will that my parents had never understood or anticipated. Her estate planning had been far more sophisticated than anyone realized, with multiple layers of legal safeguards designed to prevent exactly the kind of theft they had committed. Your grandmother established a secondary trust that activates when the primary education fund is misused, Sarah revealed during one of our meetings. This trust contains an additional $500,000 that was specifically reserved for legal fees and damages in case anyone tried to steal from your education fund. The revelation that my grandmother had anticipated and planned for my parents' theft was both shocking and deeply satisfying. She had understood their character and priorities well enough to create legal mechanisms that would ensure their crimes would be punished and my education would be protected. This means that not only will you recover every penny of the stolen funds, but you'll also receive additional compensation for the professional damage and emotional distress their actions caused, Sarah continued. Your grandmother essentially created a legal trap for anyone who tried to steal from you. The total recovery amount exceeded $1.4 million, providing more than enough funding for my medical practice, while also compensating me for the professional harm and emotional trauma caused by my family's betrayal. My grandmother's foresight and legal planning had turned their theft into a windfall that would benefit my career for decades. But beyond the financial recovery, The legal case had created a public record of their behavior that would follow them permanently. Their theft from their daughter's medical education fund had been documented in court proceedings, newspaper coverage, and professional disciplinary actions that would affect their reputations for the rest of their lives. Your father has been expelled from his professional association for violating fiduciary duties, Sarah informed me. Your mother is being investigated by her employer for ethical violations. Their theft from you has destroyed their professional credibility and social standing. The professional consequences were severe and permanent, affecting their careers and social relationships in ways that money couldn't repair. They had chosen to damage my professional reputation through their public betrayal, and now they were experiencing similar damage to their own standing in the community. Meanwhile, I was using the recovered funds to establish the medical practice I had always planned, focusing on providing affordable pediatric surgery to underserved communities. The publicity surrounding the legal case had actually enhanced my professional reputation, as people admired my strength in standing up to family theft and my commitment to using my education to help others. Dr. Palmer, we've been following your case in the medical journals, the administrator of a children's hospital told me during a meeting about potential partnerships. Your response to your family's theft showed remarkable professionalism and legal sophistication. We'd like to discuss ways to support your practice and refer patients who need your services. The professional support I was receiving demonstrated that my parents' attempt to damage my reputation had backfired completely. Instead of being seen as someone with family problems, I was being recognized as a professional who had handled a difficult situation with grace and determination. 6 months after the legal recovery, I held a grand opening ceremony for my pediatric surgery practice, focusing on the mission of providing excellent medical care to children, regardless of their family's financial circumstances. The event was attended by medical professionals, community leaders, and families who would benefit from affordable specialty care. This practice exists because my grandmother believed in investing in education and using that education to help others, I said during my opening remarks. Her foresight and legal planning ensured that attempts to steal from that mission would ultimately strengthen it instead. The speech was both a tribute to my grandmother's wisdom and a subtle reference to my parents' failed attempt to divert her bequest away from its intended purpose. Everyone present understood that this medical practice existed despite, not because of, my family's support. But the most meaningful aspect of the opening ceremony was the presence of several families whose children I would be treating, including parents who had been struggling to afford specialized surgical care for their kids. Dr. Palmer, our daughter needs heart surgery that we can't afford, one mother told me during the reception. When we heard about your practice and your commitment to affordable care, we finally felt hope that she could get the treatment she needs. The conversation reminded me why my grandmother had established the education fund, and why my medical career was more important than my family's twisted ideas about fairness and support. I was using my education and resources to make a real difference in children's lives, which was exactly what she had intended when she created the fund. As the first year of my practice concluded, I reflected on how my parents' theft had ultimately led to outcomes that were better than anything I could have achieved if they had simply honored my grandmother's wishes. The legal case had provided additional funding, enhanced my professional reputation, and created opportunities for partnerships and community support that accelerated my practice's growth and impact. The final resolution came when my parents requested a meeting to apologize for their actions and attempt to rebuild our relationship. They had spent months dealing with legal consequences, professional discipline, and social ostracism, and they were finally ready to acknowledge the magnitude of their betrayal. Aubrey, we want you to know that we understand now how wrong we were to take your inheritance, my father Harold said during our meeting. We thought we were helping Kyle, but we realize now that we were stealing from you and violating your grandmother's wishes. The apology was more comprehensive than I had expected, but it was also clearly motivated by their desire to escape the ongoing social and professional consequences of their actions, rather than genuine remorse for the harm they had caused. We see now that our favoritism toward Kyle was unfair and destructive, my mother Joyce added. We should have been proud of your achievements instead of taking them for granted. We should have supported your dreams instead of trying to redistribute your inheritance to Kyle. The acknowledgement of their favoritism and its impact was significant, but it came only after they had faced serious legal and social consequences for their behavior. They had learned about fairness and respect through punishment, rather than developing those values naturally. But the conversation that meant the most to me was with Kyle himself, who had been forced to confront the reality of his dependence and irresponsibility through the legal consequences of participating in theft from his sister's inheritance. "Aubrey, I want you to know that I'm grateful you fought back when Mom and Dad gave me your money," Kyle said during a separate meeting. "If you hadn't stopped me, I would have wasted all of it on gambling and expensive purchases. I would have learned nothing and accomplished nothing." The acknowledgement was remarkable because it showed that Kyle had finally understood the difference between earning success and having it handed to you through theft from family members. "I've enrolled in community college and gotten a part-time job," Kyle continued. "I'm finally learning what it feels like to work for something instead of expecting other people to give me what I want. I should have been doing this years ago instead of expecting you to subsidize my laziness." The personal growth was encouraging, and suggested that the legal consequences had forced Kyle to develop responsibility and self-awareness that years of family enabling had prevented. As I concluded the difficult process of rebuilding relationships with family members who had betrayed and stolen from me, I realized that my grandmother's legal planning had accomplished something far more valuable than just protecting my inheritance. It had forced accountability and growth that had ultimately strengthened our family relationships by requiring honesty, responsibility, and mutual respect. My medical practice continued to thrive, serving hundreds of children who needed affordable specialty care while building my reputation as both an excellent surgeon and a professional who would stand up for her principles when challenged. The education fund that my parents had tried to steal was fulfilling exactly the purpose my grandmother had intended, creating lasting benefits for my community while honoring her investment in my medical career. 7 years after my parents' theft, and the dramatic legal recovery that followed, I stood before a gathering of medical students at the same university where I had experienced the most humiliating moment of my life. I was delivering the commencement address for graduating doctors, sharing my story as an example of how personal integrity and professional determination can overcome even the most devastating family betrayals. "Sometimes the people who are supposed to support your dreams will try to destroy them instead," I told the audience of new physicians. "When that happens, you have a choice. You can accept their assessment of your worth, or you can fight back with every tool and skill at your disposal." The message was both personal and professional, encouraging young doctors to protect their achievements and their values, even when doing so required standing up to family members or authority figures who didn't have their best interests at heart. "My parents stole my inheritance because they thought my success meant I didn't deserve support, while my brother's failure meant he needed financial assistance," I continued. But my grandmother had anticipated this possibility and created legal protections that turned their theft into additional funding for my medical career. The story resonated with many students who had experienced similar family pressures and expectations, showing them that it was possible to maintain professional integrity while dealing with personal betrayal. But the most meaningful aspect of my return to the university was seeing the impact that my practice had made over the past 7 years. Display boards around the auditorium showed photos and stories of children whose lives had been saved through affordable pediatric surgery, families who had been able to access specialized care, and medical advances that had been made possible by the research funding generated by my practice. "This is what happens when an education fund is used for its intended purpose," I told the graduating students, gesturing toward the displays of successful treatments and grateful families. "This is why protecting your resources and your values from people who would exploit them is so important. Have you ever realized that standing up to betrayal and theft ultimately led to outcomes that exceeded your original dreams? That's exactly what I experienced as I saw how my grandmother's funding had enabled not just my career, but also comprehensive healthcare services for thousands of children who might not have received treatment otherwise." After my speech, I was approached by several students who shared their own stories of family pressure and expectations, asking for advice about how to navigate relationships with relatives who didn't understand or support their medical careers. "Dr. Palmer, my family expects me to support them financially now that I'm a doctor, but they never supported my education or showed interest in my achievements," one student told me. How do I balance family obligations with protecting my own financial security? The question was familiar because it reflected the same dynamics I had experienced with my own family. The expectation that success should be shared while sacrifice should be individual. You have the right to establish boundaries that protect your achievements and your values, I replied. Supporting family members who respect and appreciate your efforts is different from enabling relatives who take your success for granted while contributing nothing in return. The conversation continued with other students who were dealing with similar issues, and I realized that my story had become part of a larger discussion about family dynamics in high-achieving careers and the importance of protecting your resources from people who would exploit them. The most satisfying update came from Kyle himself, who had completed his community college degree and was now working as a medical equipment technician at a hospital across the country. His transformation from an unemployed dependent to a responsible professional had taken several years, but it had been genuine and sustainable. Aubrey, I wanted you to know that I've been working at this hospital for 3 years now, and I love what I do. Kyle called to update me on his progress. I'm maintaining medical equipment that saves lives every day, and I finally understand what it means to contribute something valuable to society. The career development was particularly meaningful because Kyle was now working in healthcare, contributing to the same field where I was making my own impact through pediatric surgery. I tell people about what happened with Mom and Dad and the inheritance. Kyle continued. I explain how you saved me from wasting my life by fighting back when they stole your money. I want people to understand that enabling someone's irresponsibility isn't helping them. It's preventing them from growing up. The insight about the difference between help and enabling was profound and showed that Kyle had learned lessons about personal responsibility that went far beyond just getting a job and paying his bills. My parents had also undergone significant changes, though their transformation had been more gradual and less dramatic than Kyle's complete life restructuring. They had eventually rebuilt their professional reputations and social relationships, but they had never fully recovered from the public exposure of their theft and favoritism. Aubrey, we want you to know that we understand now that what we did was theft, not just poor judgment, my father Harold told me during one of our periodic conversations. We violated your grandmother's wishes and your trust, and we created professional embarrassment that could have destroyed your medical career. The acknowledgement was more complete and honest than their initial apologies, suggesting that years of living with the consequences of their actions had deepened their understanding of the harm they had caused. We're proud of what you've accomplished with your medical practice, my mother Joyce added. You've used your grandmother's investment exactly as she intended, helping children and families while building an excellent professional reputation. We should have been supporting that mission instead of trying to divert resources away from it. The recognition of my professional achievements and their alignment with my grandmother's values was meaningful because it showed that my parents had finally learned to appreciate success based on contribution and impact, rather than just comparing their children's relative circumstances. But the most important lesson from my experience was the understanding that protecting your achievements and values from family exploitation isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining the integrity that makes those achievements meaningful and sustainable. The education fund that my parents tried to steal has now served exactly the purpose my grandmother intended, enabling thousands of successful surgeries, training dozens of medical students, and advancing research that will benefit children for generations to come. The legal protections she created didn't just recover stolen money. They ensured that her investment in education would create lasting positive change, rather than being wasted on gambling and luxury purchases. If you're reading this, and you're dealing with family members who treat your success as their personal resource, while contributing nothing in return, please know that you have the right to protect what you've earned and achieved. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable behavior that prevents growth and accountability. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. It's necessary for healthy relationships. Protecting your achievements isn't selfish. It's responsible stewardship of opportunities and resources that should be used for their intended purposes. And sometimes the people who claim to need your help the most are actually capable of supporting themselves if they're required to do so. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between family expectations and protecting your own achievements? How did you handle situations where relatives expected you to subsidize their choices while dismissing your success? Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that your achievements are worth protecting from people who would exploit them rather than appreciate them. See you in our next story here at Her Sweet Revenge.